And good afternoon. I'm going to take this off. Do I need to wear this? Okay. Take it off. And thanks for being here. It's gorgeous outside.
Well, listen, I'm going to move to another place.
Okay.
And I'll be back.
Okay. It's a gorgeous day, so thank you so much for spending some time with me. This is about athletes and protests and demands, and if you've been following what's going on with the situation between Russia and Ukraine, there have been a number of protests by athletes and organizations. For instance, UEFA, which is the group that handles European soccer, has pulled the championship game out of St. Petersburg. The Grand Prix that was supposed to take place in Sochi, Russia in September, has been pulled out. And there are countries who do not want to see Russia in the World Cup. And that's kind of interesting because you don't generally see this, but this is individual, or maybe not individual, groups. Basically in the United States, this is Black History Month. A lot of this is tied into Black History Month. And then also, starting on Tuesday, it's International Women's Month, with March 8th being International Women's Day. So it kind of, this talk hits a number of areas. Athletes, sports protests, and demands. That's Colin Kaepernick, who took a knee in 2016 prior to preseason games for his team, the San Francisco 49ers. And he took a knee protesting police brutality, and that was during the Star-Spangled Banner, and he eventually would be blackballed from the National Football League. Shut up and dribble! That's what you're supposed to do. You're a jock. You're not supposed to do anything else but shut up and dribble, at least according to Laura Ingraham, who is with Fox News. And Shut Up and Dribble would become a title for a TV show by LeBron James. Do protests actually work? Some do, some don't, most don't. Elgin Baylor, 1959, protested the segregation in Charleston, West Virginia, and that changed the National Basketball Association. The American Football League, their African American players boycotted the 1965 game in New Orleans, and it led through a series of steps to the creation of the Super Bowl. The National Football League, Martin Luther King Day was not recognized as a holiday in Arizona. National Football League says, recognize it? Well, we're pulling the Super Bowl out of Tempe in 1993. They did. National Football League was forced to desegregate in 1946 by the Los Angeles Coliseum Commission. Baseball didn't bow to protests in the 1930s and desegregate. 1960s saw protests. Sports was no different than anything else in the 1960s. You had Freedom Riders, you had protests in the South against Jim Crow, and then protests against the Vietnam War. And that's all connected to sports. Protests and discussions in 2020 re-emerged. NBA players, NFL players after the George Floyd killing in Minneapolis. Protests did go dormant for a long time until the George Floyd incident. And you have more protests now, obviously, as Russia has invaded Ukraine. Colin Kaepernick, the San Francisco 49ers quarterback. More than likely, he was blackballed. He hasn't played since 2016, and he's not going to play again. Why he protested? He protested against police brutality. Harry Edwards. Harry Edwards is an interesting character. He's all 6'9". I had breakfast with him in Indianapolis in around 2001. He said, "You coming to breakfast with me?" And I said, "Yes, sir. You're 6'9". You want me at breakfast? I'm coming. Anyway, 1968, Mexico City Olympics protest. Harry Edwards was involved in that, and he was involved with Colin Kaepernick in 2016. Kaepernick reached a settlement with the league. There was supposed to be a tryout, but that was botched. He is now a political activist. And there he was during his protest in 2016. On August 26, 2016, Colin Kaepernick refused to stand for the national anthem. I'm not going to stand up to show pride in a flag for a country that oppresses black people and people of color. To me, this is bigger than football. It would be very selfish on my part to look the other way. Oh, by the way, Kaepernick, of course, was criticized by a lot of people, but at one point, the National Football League didn't require the players to be out during the national anthem. They could be in the locker room getting ready for the game. The anthem was played about 7 minutes before the game, so they would come out after the game, and that all changed because the Pentagon gave the National Football League and the TV networks $53 million between 2012 and 2015 for advertising. And what better to advertise for the Pentagon but a bunch of players standing at attention during the Star-Spangled Banner. But before that, no big deal. No big deal about the anthem. And there is Harry Edwards, who ended up being a professor at Stanford University. He, in 1967 or so, helped form the Olympic Project for Human Rights to organize an African-American boycott of the 1968 Mexico City Summer Olympics. Edwards would coach Kaepernick when he learned of Kaepernick's protest. And there's the Olympic badge from 1968, Olympic Project for Human Rights. Social protest impact. Well, that's a good question whether they had any impact after George Floyd in 2020. Yeah, there were a lot of protests by athletes and by people in the streets, but whether or not they had any kind of impact on sports, still, you could say it could be decided yes or no. Adam Silver is the commissioner of the National Basketball Association, and he said, okay, you want to protest? Go ahead. You can put Black Lives Matters on your shirts, slogans on your shirts, other kind of slogans. And also, players would be active. They could speak out. They could go to demonstrations and be part of demonstrations. Sports protests, August of 2020, the Milwaukee Bucks didn't play a game against Orlando in the bubble by Disney World because of a shooting of Jacob Blake in Kenosha, Wisconsin. The Milwaukee players didn't show up. Some of the Milwaukee players had been harassed by police in Milwaukee, and they said, we're not playing. This is our protest, and there was no game between the Bucks and Orlando. And it was led by a guy by the name of George Hill, and he pointed out, we've had problems with police in Milwaukee before, and the Kenosha police shooting was the catalyst for the boycott. Even the National Hockey League, a league that is mostly white, about 95% white, they had protests as well, and games were not played. The NBA would end up in 2020 postponing 3 games. The Bucks Magic game along with Oklahoma City and Houston, and the Los Angeles Lakers in Portland. Protests spread to Major League Baseball. Cincinnati at Milwaukee game postponed. Milwaukee was 35 miles, or is 35 miles from Kenosha. Players in the NHL stopped the playoffs for 2 days, pushing for social change. It's an ongoing story. The WNBA, the Women's League, did not play games also because of a players' protest. National Football League Commissioner Roger Goodell, who lives over in Bronxville, New York, he's had a rocky, very rocky relationship along with the owners over the past few years with players protesting, obviously, with Kaepernick. But there have been some changes in the National Football League. Corporate pressure on Daniel Snyder led to the changing of his Washington team to the Commanders. The last 2 years, the Black National Anthem, called Lift Every Voice and Sing, was played before games. The NFL acknowledged that Black Lives Matter. And they also said players should speak out. Some fans booed at the 2020 season opener. Now remember, football is everything what America is about. It's violence, it's military discipline. It's also betting and eating. Football is the national game because of that. Other leagues responding to other protesters, such as Native Americans, who didn't like the logo of the Cleveland Indians, or the name, Cleveland Indians. They changed their name to the Cleveland Guardians. The Edmonton Eskimos perceived as a slur, Eskimos. They changed their brand name to the Washington Elks. The Washington Redskins became the Commanders, Washington Commanders, and there's now NHL diversity. Equal pay. Now let me ask women in here. Do women deserve equal pay for equal jobs with men? Yes or no?
Yes.
Yes. 1955, there was a congresswoman by the name of Edith Green. She was in her first year. She had been elected in 1954 to the Senate, and one of the first things she did was push for an Equal Pay Act, and she got it passed. And John Kennedy signed it into law in 1963, and it said, yeah, women deserve equal pay, but the law has never, ever, ever been enforced. Well, these women here, part of the United States national women's team, decided about 6 years ago, we should get paid as much as the men. Why? We generate as much revenue as men, and besides, we've been more successful than the men's team. So pay us. Well, they go to court in 2016. Actually, they don't go to court quite yet, but they file a complaint against U.S. Soccer, the governing body of soccer in the United States, for wage discrimination in 2016. The 28 members of the national team filed a discrimination lawsuit in March of 2019. Remember, it's on the books. Equal Pay Act, 1963. Women get equal pay to men, regardless. Federal law, except it was never enforced. The bid for equal pay. Well, the players sought $66 million in damages. But the court said, no, you're not entitled to it. We don't even want to take the case. Leading to an appeal. The United States Soccer Federation offered identical contracts to men and women's teams in an attempt to resolve the gender pay dispute in September 2021. This is a ticker tape parade message after the team wins the World Cup. Equal pay, equal pay, equal pay, equal pay. How many times have you heard that from women? We should get the same money as men. Equal pay. Ticker tape parade down Broadway. Equal pay. On February 22nd, 2022, just a week ago, less than a week ago, there's an agreement that calls for the players to receive $22 million in direct payment to be distributed in a manner proposed by the USWNT players. It's approved by a federal court. U.S. Soccer has committed to provide an equal rate of pay going forward for the men's and women's national teams in games, including the World Cup. It was a victory for women at a time where in the United States, women's rights are being rolled back and rolled back and rolled back. But there's a victory. And there's women's sports. And there is the team. The protests stopped until about a month ago. That's Stephen Ross, New York State real estate tycoon. And I've had my dealings with Stephen Ross over the last 17, 18 years, and I don't like the guy. I don't like the guy. But that's me dealing with him and Jay Kriegel and some of the other people I dealt with in that orbit. And that's Brian Flores. He was his coach of the Miami Dolphins National Football League team. And Brian Flores was fired in January of 2022. Now, normally a coach gets fired, takes a year off, or he goes somewhere else and takes a job. But not in this case. Coincidentally, it's the first day of Black History Month. And Brian Flores, who came from Honduras, grew up in Brooklyn, and ended up being a National Football League coach, former Miami Dolphins coach at this point, files a class action suit against the National Football League. He alleged discrimination regarding the interview process for a job with the New York Giants in January and one a few years ago with Denver. But the January 2022 job interview, he alleged that the Giants conducted a sham interview with him after hiring someone else, just so they could placate the National Football League and say, hey, we hired a minority candidate. He alleged that the Giants conducted the sham interview after hiring someone else. What he was seeking, increased influence of black individuals in hiring. increase the objectivity of hiring or terminating general managers, head coaches, and coordinators, and increase the number of black defensive and offensive coordinators. Also, incentivize hiring or retaining black GMs, head coaches, and coordinators. Transparency of pay for GMs, head coaches, and coordinators. Let us know what the other guy is making. And he would get a job, though. He would get a job with Pittsburgh in the Rooney family as an assistance coach, but the lawsuit is continuing. Jackie Robinson, how many old Brooklyn Dodger fans are here? You went to Ebbets Field?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah. Number 42, right?
Right.
Number 42. And they did win a championship, right? 1955, and then they moved away. Jackie Robinson became the first African-American, or, using the proper terminology in the 1940s, Negro, to play Major League Baseball on April 15, 1947, for the first time since 1884. So he makes his debut with Brooklyn, and he views his sports celebrity as a platform for which he can challenge American racism. Now let's go back to 1884. That is Moses Fleetwood Walker. He was a catcher, and he played on the Toledo team in 1884. In fact, he and his brother played on the team. It was a team in the American Association, which was a major league at that point. He makes his debut May 1st, 1884. He's a catcher for the Toledo Blue Stockings. And it's a game against Louisville and the Eclipse squad. Now, 1883, Chicago White Stockings of the National League arrived in Toledo for an August 1883 exhibition game. Cap Anson's one of the biggest stars in baseball at that point. He's the player-manager of the Chicago team. And he was furious, absolutely furious, because he learned that his team is going to play Toledo when they had a black player. And there is Anson, who is in baseball's Hall of Fame and credited with kicking Negroes out of baseball. Anson grudgingly put his team on the field because he wanted to make some money. And as everybody knows, money talks and nobody walks. So he doesn't want to give up his share of the gate receipts, but he said, I'll never play again against a team that has a black man. And he never did. Anson was very vocal, both on and off the field, about keeping baseball segregated, to the point where he was considered the father of segregated baseball. The Walker brothers. Moses Fleetwood Walker played 42 games in 1884. In July, he's joined by his brother, Weldy, played a few games as an outfielder. But the Walker brothers' major league careers were done by the fall of 1884. Baseball throws a color barrier up. Now this guy, Sam Lacy, I met him in the 1980s. He was a newspaper, my background's radio, TV, newspapers. He was a newspaper reporter out of Baltimore for a black newspaper. In 1936, he begins to lobby the Washington Senators' owner, Clark Griffith, to consider adding stars from the Negro League. In particular, those playing for the Washington-based Homestead Grays, which leased Griffith Stadium from Clark Griffith. So it takes a while, it takes almost 2 years, but he does get a face-to-face meeting with Clark Griffith in December 1937. And Clark Griffith says, baseball's not ready for Negro players. Lacy said, I used the old cliche about Washington being first in war, first in peace, and last in the American League, and that he could remedy that. But he told me the climate wasn't right. He pointed out there were a lot of Southern ball players in the league. Jim Crow, grew up with Jim Crow. And there would be constant confrontations, and moreover, it would break up the Negro leagues. And the Negro leagues, at least for a lot of baseball clubs in those days, Washington, the Yankees, and others, source of revenue, because that's where Negro League games were taking place, big league stadiums. Wendell Smith is supposed to be, or supposedly was a friend of Jackie Robinson. He is credited with recommending Robinson to the Brooklyn Dodgers general manager Branch Rickey. who is looking for the individual with the strong character to successfully execute the integration of baseball. Now, in the 1930s, New York City, that's New York City, admit Negroes to big league baseball. Admit Negroes to big league baseball. We demand more gyms. So here's protest in New York City. Hey, it's time to hire a black player. And political pressure comes as well. Unions and civil rights groups picketed outside of Yankee Stadium, the Polo Grounds at Ebbets Field, and also in Comiskey Park, in Chicago, and Wrigley Field. And they got more than 1 million signees on petitions demanding baseball tear down the color barrier. 1940, the Trade Union Athletic Association held an End Jim Crow in Baseball demonstration at the New York World's Fair. The 1939-1940 World's Fair, where you're not supposed to have protests, right? At the World's Fair, everybody's supposed to have a good time. They have a protest at the World's Fair. The Wizard of Oz, well, no, not quite, but he's the baseball commissioner, and he is from Georgia, Kennesaw Mountain Landis, and he says, nothing I can do. It's up to the owners. I can't order any of them to hire any black players, even though in 1943, Boston gave a tryout to people like Jackie Robinson. But it was a sham tryout. The petitions ask baseball fans, if the Yankees, the Dodgers, or Giants were to sign a black player, and if they were to make the team, would you go to Dodger games? And obviously you went to Dodger games with Newcomb. Don Newcomb was there, Roy Campanella was there, and of course Jackie, and of course they had their Jewish player in Cal Abrams at that point, and eventually Sandy Koufax. After 1.5 years, 1.5 million signatures given to Judge Landis, the Commissioner of Baseball. When the Commissioner of Baseball, Judge Landis, was asked point blank, he was a federal judge at one point, a former federal judge. Not up to me, somebody else, not me. The same guy who threw 8 players from the Chicago White Sox out of baseball in 1920 or 21 because they bet on they threw the 1919 World Series, allegedly. He could do that, but he could not lift the color barrier. Now, politics comes in. 1945. Running for re-election to the New York City Council in 1945, Ben Davis, an African-American former college football star and a communist, he admitted he was a communist, distributed a leaflet with 2 photos of blacks on the leaflet. One, a dead soldier. The other, baseball player. Good enough to die for his country, but not good enough for organized baseball. Weren't letting him in. The New York State Legislature gets in the act, and this probably spurs the Dodgers on more than anything else. It's called the Quinn Ives Act, and it banned discrimination in hiring and soon formed a committee to investigate discriminatory hiring practices, including those focused on baseball. Ralph Kiner. Anybody remember Ralph Kiner, the Mets announcer? I loved Ralph. Ralph was great. He used to tell me stories all the time. He was a union organizer in 1946 in baseball, World War II veteran, and a guy who knew what was going on. And he talked about serving in the war, World War II. And his thoughts on how baseball had to desegregate. It's just another part of the changeover of baseball. It had to happen sooner or later. It really was an aftermath of World War II where the black players, or Negroes, fought for our side. They had to be recognized. There was a movement at the time, which was Ben Davis in New York City and New York State, and the demonstrations, there was a movement at the time that they were going to bring black players into the game. Branch Rickey, who Ralph didn't like him at all, because he was his boss in Pittsburgh. Rickey was the man who picked Robinson. That was a brilliant choice. And Jackie played his career with the Brooklyn Dodgers, 10 years, but he did not finish his career as an employee of the Brooklyn Dodgers. he was traded to the New York Giants. In 1956, Robinson became an executive with Chock full of nuts. Remember Chock full of nuts, the Heavenly coffee? Another coffee a billionaires money can't buy. Anyway, so he becomes vice president. And he's beginning to transition out of baseball to become an advocate for, to desegregate corporate America, integrating corporate America. He lent his name and his prestige to several business ventures, including a construction company, a black-owned bank in Harlem, but he does not retire as a Dodger. He's traded to the Giants for Dick Littlefield. But he doesn't tell anybody he's retiring because he got a whole bunch of money from Look magazine to sit on the story. So as far as baseball fans were concerned, he retired because he was traded to the Giants. The truth was he retired before the trade, but couldn't tell anybody because he had this job lined up with chock full of nuts and was going to be an exclusive to a magazine. And as a journalist, I hate that. I don't believe you should be paying subjects for a story. You shouldn't be paying for playing, but it happened then. Oh, Jackie Robinson never got a job in baseball. Pumpsie Green was the first African-American to play for the Boston Red Sox in 1959, 12 years after Jackie broke in. Red Sox, in 1959, the last team to integrate. Baseball moved slowly. Tom Yawkey was from South Carolina, and he finally gives in 1959. Jackie Robinson, 40 years after he breaks in, gets this guy fired inadvertently. His name is Al Campanis, and remember Nightline with Ted Koppel? Remember that started after the embassy in Tehran was overrun, the U.S. embassy, and the hostages were taken. And I happened to, and as a 24-year-old, right? Yeah, I was 24. In 1981, I went up to Stewart Air Force Base to cover the hostages returning to America, but we never spoke to any of them. We got to wave to them. They wouldn't let us speak to any of them. They just zipped by a bus. Anyway, Campanis is friends with Jackie Robinson, and he's on Ted Koppel's Nightline show. It's April 6, 1987, opening of the 1987 baseball season with the 40th anniversary of Jackie Robinson breaking in coming up. And Koppel asks a question of Campanis, who's the Dodger general manager at the time. And he says, why aren't there more black managers, more black general managers? And he says, I don't think it's prejudice. I truly believe that they may not have some of the necessities to be, let's say, a field manager or perhaps a general manager. He's saying African American players are stupid, which is something that the National Football League said about its players in the 50s and 60s. They couldn't be quarterbacks, centers, and linebackers. And this is a friend of Jackie Robinson. And Koppel pulls back, and Koppel wants to gives him some rope, and he says, did you really say what you just said? And he did. His story was never told in the book, Campanis. He never worked again in the Major League office. He was a regular at Los Angeles Dodgers and Anaheim Angels games, taking notes, offering scouting reports for nothing. He spent 2 years writing a book called My Turn at Bat, but his son Jimmy says, couldn't interest any publishers. That was it. Couldn't interest any publishers. Now you know Paul Robeson, right? Old Man River. Old Man River. He was a big-time athlete. Rutgers. Maybe the best football player of his day, going to Rutgers University, then goes to Columbia Law School, and of course he's on stage. He's a student trying out for the Rutgers football team. He made the team after enduring a brutal initiation rite during inter-squad scrimmages. October 14, 1916, game at Rutgers. The Washington and Lee coach, a guy by the name of Foster Sanford, wanted, hey, bench him. He asked the Rutgers coach, Foster Sanford, to bench him. And Sanford said, yeah, okay, I'll bench him. We'll have all white players on the field. The game ended in 13-13 tie. The teammates weren't too happy. Weren't very happy at all. And a couple of weeks later, they're playing West Virginia, Rutgers is. Coach says, hey, sit them down. Coach refuses. Rutgers keeps him going. And Robeson makes a game-saving tackle to preserve a 0-0 tie. This poor Robeson, singing the national anthem in 1942. Now, Paul Robeson had gone to the Soviet Union by this point, and there were all kinds of difficulties in translations of transcripts or whatever, saying that he said allegedly that Negroes wouldn't fight against the Soviets on the American side, and he never said that. The translation was botched. And he would get in trouble for that. In fact, he'd get blackballed for that eventually. But here he is singing the national anthem in 1942. And in 1943, Paul Robeson says, I want to talk to Major League Baseball owners. I want to speak to the 16 owners. And I want to speak to them at the annual meeting in New York in the winter. And Judge Landis says, let them speak. Ignore them. Don't ask any questions. Just let them speak. And that's it. And that's what happened. He was a superior athlete. By the way, at Rutgers, he was a valedictorian. Played in the National Football League in 1921. Actor and a singer. Adored in the Soviet Union. 1949 speech was quoted by an Associated Press reporter, would cause problems if there was a war between the U.S. and the Soviets. And there he is in one of his roles. Robeson would take on Jackie Robinson, 1949 speech. Robinson called before Congress to denounce Paul Robeson. Robeson had traveled many times to the Soviet Union and allegedly said Negroes would never fight against the Soviet Union. That is the problem. Robeson was blackballed. Jackie Robinson was called in saying, how could he say that? Throwing Robeson under the bus. Years later, Robeson regretted going before Congress, rather Robinson, before Congress, throwing Robeson under the bus. Elgin Baylor was a great basketball player. Passed away about a year ago. And he played for the Minneapolis and the Los Angeles Lakers. 1959 is his rookie season. And Minneapolis at the time, like a lot of other NBA teams, just looking for a court to play on and make some money. And Baylor is playing against the Cincinnati Royals, or his team's playing against the Cincinnati Royals, and they scheduled the game for Charleston, West Virginia. Baylor and his black teammates on the Lakers could not stay at the all-white hotel with the rest of the team. Remember Green Book? Did you see the movie Green Book? Yeah. Which was put out by a guy by the name of Green in about 1935 in Harlem, and it was basically a motorist guide, a Negro motorist guide to where you could get gas, where you could eat, where you could stay, wherever you went. And obviously, this hotel in Charleston, West Virginia wasn't desegregated. And they wouldn't integrate for Elgin Baylor. Elgin Baylor, hotel snubs Baylor, he refuses to play. Lakers play and eat as a team. It's a big story. It's a big, big story. I love playing, I love basketball. I like playing in the league very much, said Baylor, but not at the expense of my dignity. And there is the Lakers owner, Bob Short, who is privately fuming that Elgin Baylor takes this civil rights stand. Short and Maurice Pudeloff, who is the NBA president, were irate, but publicly they sided with Baylor. And ultimately, the league would change its rules. So teams would not play in segregated states unless the teams were guaranteed shared accommodations for all players. They didn't talk about restaurants. There's Walter Beach. We have one thing in common, me and Walter Beach. He went to Central Michigan University back in the late 50s, and I spoke at Central Michigan University on April 15th, 1999. Anyway, Walter Beach is a player with the Boston Patriots of the American Football League. And the Boston Patriots in 1961, going down to New Orleans. They're going to play a preseason game. New Orleans, of course, was the South. And it was Jim Crow. And there was a tradition in New Orleans that if you were a Negro, you couldn't get a cab. unless you were accompanied by a white guy. Then you could get into the cab because the white guy would take responsibility for whatever way you acted. Walter Beach was fired by the Boston Patriots in 1961, labeled a troublemaker for organizing a protest among black players against segregated living conditions during the team's two-day road trip to New Orleans. He wanted to eat with his teammates and stay with his teammates instead of doing the Green Book, taking a separate bus, going across town, staying at a third-rate hotel, and eating at a local restaurant. He's part of the team until he's not. He's fired. There was a boycott in Lexington, Kentucky in 1961 by the Boston Celtics, which might have been inspired by Walter Beach. There was Bill Russell, and this boycott of a game in Lexington, the preseason game, Bill Russell and other members of the Boston Celtics basketball team, black members, were refused service at the restaurant. Players said, "We're not playing." Blacks were still expected not to complain publicly about discrimination. Bill Russell, Casey Jones, and Seth Sanders, along with Sam Jones, went to see Red Auerbach. I told Red we were leaving. I said it was because it was important to me that everyone, everywhere, knows that the black players are deciding they'll stand up for themselves. And so there was a boycott, Lexington, Kentucky. Sam Jones and Seth Sanders were refused service at a coffee shop at the team hotel. Allowed to stay in the hotel, right? But you can't eat there. We'd gone downstairs to eat, and they said, "Well, we really can't serve you people." That was Seth Sanders just 4 years ago. A fifth player for the Celtics, a rookie by the name of Al Butler, left with them. Two black players for the Hawks, St. Louis Hawks was the team they were playing, joined the boycott. One of the St. Louis players was Cleo Hill, first-round pick earlier that year, who was denied service in Lexington. Russell had clout. Hill didn't. There is one of the few pictures of Cleo Hill playing basketball. During the 1961-62 season, the St. Louis Hawks coach, Paul Seymour, was told by team management to severely diminish Hill's offensive role so that the stars Bob Pettit, Cliff Hagan, and Clyde Levelette, who were all white, would receive more shots. Seymour said, "Nope, that's the way we play," but and he was fired. The new coach comes in, Hill's scoring average drops from 10 points a game to 5, never plays a game in the NBA after that season. Hill said, "Well, I don't think race played a part of the end of his career." 1963, Mobile, Alabama, Jim Crow again. Al Davis, coach of the Oakland Raiders, Freddie the Hammer Williamson back there, Clement Daniels, Art Powell, Jim Otto with blondish hair. Raiders are going to play the New York Jets preseason game in Mobile, Alabama. But 6 African-American members of the Oakland Raiders refused to play in the preseason game against the Jets at Ladd Stadium because it had segregated seating. Mobile had hosted 3 American Football League games in 1960, 61, and 62. And there was Al Davis, the rookie coach. It was Clem Daniels, Art Powell, Bo Roberson, Fred Williamson, Proverb Jones, and Eugene White. "We're not playing." Al Davis said, "Good, let's go back to Oakland. We'll play in Oakland." And there is Mobile. Now, check out this quote by Ray Schuessler, who is the general manager of the stadium, or the manager of the stadium. Listen to how he's talking about these guys. "We don't want 4 boys from Oakland telling us how to run our stadium. We're going to integrate quietly. Now, we're going to go ahead, as in the past, for other exhibition games here." He never had another exhibition game there. Clement Daniels said, "I wanted to play in Mobile before an integrated crowd and contribute in a small way to breaking down these needless prejudices." The game was played in Oakland. The AFL never returned to Mobile. The 1965 Senior Bowl in Mobile was integrated, although the organizers, like Schuessler, did not want to do so. Cookie Gilchrist was a running back with the Buffalo Bills back in the 1960s in Denver, also played in the Canadian Football League. And he leads a boycott of the American Football League's All-Star Game in New Orleans, 1965, fighting for the same thing Walter Beach did 3.5 years earlier. The American Football League was the only league that truly embraced African American players as equals with the white players. And here they are. They're leaving New Orleans. You got Butch Bird back there without the hat, Earl Faison with the hat. I don't know who's looking down. And Curtis McClinton, who was with the Kansas City Chiefs with the tickets in his hands. New Orleans. Why New Orleans? Why a postseason All-Star game there? Well, the American Football League wanted to go there. New Orleans leader said, hey, the city was going to welcome the All-Stars, 22 black players, with open arms. Segregation, Jim Crow, just ending. The city wants a professional team. And equals. The black players and the white players were pretty equal. You got 5 players who are white, 3 players who are black on the program of the All-Star game in 1963 in San Diego. They were equal on the field. NFL went to watch players from big-time schools and conferences. The AFL looked for players with different backgrounds, from Grambling and Bethune-Cookman and Prairie View. Ironically, the Civil Rights Act in 1964 destroyed black college programs as the best players could attend the big schools in the South: Alabama, Louisiana State, Georgia, Tennessee, North and South Carolina, Oklahoma, Arkansas, Mississippi, Florida, Florida State, and Miami. Players would be welcomed with open arms. See, he's got his open arms. That's Ernie Ladd. But the players' experience at the airport was the first bad sign. Cab after cab past Clendon Daniels, even as white players zoomed off without waving. When a black player hopped in with a white teammate, the cabbie would say, no can go, although one did. The black players were denied access at restaurants and nightclubs in the French Quarter. One player, Ernie Ladd, claimed that a bouncer pulled a gun on him when he tried to enter a club. Abner Haynes, my buddy down in Dallas, wanted me to co-write an autobiography. I said I don't have the time to do so, and I probably wouldn't do a good job. He started telling me stories. I think he got somebody else to do it. He's talking about going from the airport to the Hotel Roosevelt. Remember the old hand-cranked elevators where there was somebody sitting there, they pulled the crank and opened up the gate? Well, he said he and David Grayson get done checking in. They give their name, rank, and serial number. Abner Haynes, running back, Kansas City Chiefs, American Football League All-Star. And he gets to the elevator. And there's a woman there. He says she's an old white woman. And then this is Abner telling the rest of the story. They had a woman operating the elevator, and she said, you monkeys coming in, get to the back. Finally, we had about 10 or 12 guys in my room. We're talking sensibly. We're going to stay together. This is just another test. We had no leverage. We weren't playing for money, but we were playing for progress. Football players took the lead. Not true. Elgin Baylor took the lead in basketball, but these football players were fighting for civil rights, and they were doing it all on their own. No Southern no Southern Conference leadership and Martin Luther King group there. None of the other groups, no SNCC. Football players took the lead. Places like Atlanta, New Orleans, Miami were death holes. Dave Grayson couldn't get a drink at the bar. Our white teammates in New Orleans were there for us. Guy Jack Kemp, who ran for vice president in 1996 with Bob Dole as a Republican, and here I am with him. That's 1979 in Spark Hill, New York. And I'm 23, interviewing a presidential candidate. He was running for president at the time. Years later, I showed him the picture. He said, what happened to your hair? I said, I don't know, what happened to your wig? Well, it was white. Abner Haynes, one of the things we needed for the AFL was the unity of the white-black players. When the white players, Kemp, Jerry Mays, our Kansas City defensive leader, or 4 or 5 others, heard about what was happening, their characters showed, and my teammates were looking after me. Teammates like Ron Mix, I spoke to him in 2014 about this. We were aware that New Orleans was hosting the game to demonstrate to the American Football League and National Football League New Orleans, could support the football franchise. The last thing we wanted to do was assist them in demonstrating they could support the franchise. A boycott was the only alternative for the players. The mayor of New Orleans, Victor Shiro, was very upset. He said the black players should just have rolled with the punches. The governor, John McKeithen, there are some clubs down on Bourbon Street that won't even let our district attorney, Jim Garrison, in. The boycott. New Orleans was on the outside looking in. New Orleans would become a political pawn, and the Super Bowl would rise out of the ashes of the boycott. Remember this guy, Muhammad Ali? Remember him? It's me and him in 1985. He identified with Jack Johnson. There was a play on Broadway called The Great White Hope with James Earl Jones, based on the life of Jack Johnson. Ali said, take the issue of white women, replace it with religion, that's my story. Johnson dated white women, was married 3 times to all white women. In 1910, the Mann Act was passed basically to get even with Jack Johnson because he took white women across state lines. Congress passed the Mann Act in 1909, signed into law by William Howard Taft, the president in 1910. The law made it illegal to transport any girl or woman over state lines for immoral purposes. Johnson arrested, sent to jail for a year. He would flee Europe after getting out of jail. Trump pardons him in 2018. Charlie Chaplin and Chuck Berry were arrested under the Mann Act. Ali, of course, decided he wasn't going to join the military in April of 1967. Why should they ask me to put on a uniform, and go 10,000 miles from home and drop bombs and bullets on brown people, while so-called Negro people in Louisville are treated like dogs and denied simple human rights? There I am, side view of me, interviewing Ali back in 1982. Ali was drafted by the United States military in 1966, called up for induction in 1967, attended the induction, but refused to answer his name or take the oath. This led to his arrest and conviction, which in June 1971 was overturned by the Supreme Court. This is 1968, the Cleveland Summit. Walter Beach is there. Remember, he got fired in 1961. He's one of the guys in the back. And Jim Brown, that's Lou Alcindor, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, Bill Russell, they interviewed Ali to see if he was sincere about not going into the Army. Jim Brown told me once, I felt with Ali taking the position he was taking, with him losing the crown, and with the government coming at him with everything they had, that we as a body, prominent athletes, could get the truth and stand by Ali and give him the necessary support. The 11 athletes supported him. That's my wife at the Atlanta Museum, the Martin Luther King Center, where you walk with, you simulate doing a walk of all the protests in the South. Arizona, in the Martin Luther King holiday. Without the Super Bowl, it might have taken longer for Arizona to recognize the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Day. 1990, the NFL awarded Super Bowl 27 to Tempe, Arizona, knowing that the state was not on board with the celebration. The NFL owners got assurances that would change. Well, it didn't. Didn't at all. In 1989, the state legislature did pass legislation to create a holiday, but opponents got names on a petition and said, let's vote on it in November 1990. The Arizona legislature's decision was overturned. The voters said no in 1990, and the Super Bowl went to Pasadena, California. NFL said, 1992, do it again. If you vote for Martin Luther King Day, this is presidential election year, we'll give you the 1996 Super Bowl. 1992, under pressure to get a Super Bowl from the NFL, voters said yes. Football and racism. Los Angeles Coliseum commissioners told Daniel Reeves, the owner of the Cleveland Rams, you could play at our stadium in 1946, but you had to hire Negro players. And he did. He hired 2, Kenny Washington and Woody Strode, who became an actor. There was an informal ban on having Negro players in the NFL between 1933 and 1945. It was believed that George Preston Marshall, the Boston owner, pushed for the ban in 1932. It's my friend Wally Triplett, who passed away last year. He was talked about racism in college football to me. He was one of 2 Negro Penn State players who desegregated the Cotton Bowl in Dallas in 1948. His team, Penn State, wanted to play in the Cotton Bowl, play Southern Methodist University. Cotton Bowl said, yeah, we want you, but you got to leave the 2 guys at home, Triplett and Dennis Hoggard. Penn State said, no, we're taking them. They ended up practicing at the Dallas Naval Air Station and played the game. Racism in the NFL, there was an unofficial quota of 4 Negroes per team in the NFL. No Negro could be a quarterback, center, or middle linebacker because Negroes lacked intelligence. John Wooden, who played in the NFL, talked about something that went on in 1956. He was 56. He was an outstanding player at the University of Colorado. Colorado was supposed to play Clemson at the Miami Orange Bowl, but the Orange Bowl committee said, well, you know what? We don't want Frank Clark. We don't want Wooden there. Well, why? Because they're Negroes. Colorado's football team said, no, you're going to go, and if we're not there, you explain it to people. Well, they ended up being there. The quota, that was my friend Irv Cross, who passed away in the last year. Talked about the 1961 Philadelphia Eagles team that he was on. He said, there's the quota: Tim Brown, Ted Dean, Clarence Peake, and me. Told me that last 2 years ago. George Preston Marshall was forced by the Kennedy administration to desegregate. In the 1950s, well, couldn't have quarterback, center, or middle linebacker. College quarterbacks became defensive backs, receivers or halfbacks, and George Preston Marshall said, I'm not hiring a Negro until the Harlem Globetrotters hire a white player. John F. Kennedy and Marshall. Cleveland would trade Bobby Mitchell to Washington in a straight football deal initiated by the Kennedy administration. Cleveland got the NFL rights to Syracuse running back Ernie Davis, who would die the next year, 1963, from leukemia. Marshall wanted to move into a new stadium in 1962, and the Kennedy administration said, you can hire Negro players. You can move into that stadium. Marshall's hand was forced by Stuart Udall, who was the Secretary of the Interior, and he pointed out, you got to obey the law. It's a federal facility, equal opportunity employment. Udall gives Marshall an ultimatum: hire Negro players or find somewhere else to play. He does. Curt Flood challenged baseball's reserve clause in 1970. This is a conversation I had with him about being traded and not wanting to be traded. Evan, I'm so pleased you said that, asking him about the fans' joy of seeing trades made by teams. I guess a week went by before you say to yourself, this is not a joke, it's serious, you no longer work here. And I guess about a week, I talked to Alan Zerman, who was my attorney in St. Louis. He said, Kurt, baseball's been doing this to men, training them, for 200 years, and you're just part of the machinery, and there's very little you can do about it. You can challenge this if you want to, and it started to germinate that something illegal had been done to me, something almost inhumane had been done to me. Kind of snowballed from there. He gets a lawyer, the former Supreme Court Justice Arthur Goldberg. I learned a lot about the law system. He challenged baseball and lost, and how it operates. I guess not playing 1 year, 1970, it is necessary to be damaged in that 1 year, and that would have done that. And I thought about later on, I wish I had not played 1 year, 1971, with Washington Senators, and the only thing that made me do it was manager Ted Williams. I loved him. Supreme Court, I guess they felt the same way, that being a baseball player is the best of all worlds. I ought to sit down someplace and shut up. Wait, they were still using that shut up language in 2020. This is about 1989 when I interviewed them. Supreme Court didn't say that. They just said they're going to leave this decision to someone else. The NBA barred Negroes. In 1946, a new basketball league called the Basketball Association of America formed with teams in the big cities in the East: New York, Philadelphia, Boston, Washington. Arena owners were looking to fill dates. For some reason, the BAA owners put up a color barrier. John McClendon, who I interviewed about 20 years ago, actually here in White Plains. John McClendon was coaching for the North Carolina College for Negroes, and he would tell the NBA teams, hey, there are players that can play in the league. McClendon got the Washington Capitals to look at some players he thought should be in the league, and Earl Lloyd would be the first African-American player to play in the NBA. The Washington Capitals were the first team to have historically black school products on their team. They preceded Boston by a week. McClendon told me that in 1990 there were two guys ahead of the Boston Celtics, Harold Hunter and Earl Lloyd. The NBA did have an Asian on their team. Wat Misaka, who played with the New York Knicks, not too long after Japanese internment camps were shut down. They were not in an internment camp because the family was in Utah, not the West Coast. George Steinbrenner would hire McClendon as the coach of the Cleveland Pipers of the American Basketball League, and McClendon would become the first African American or black coach in pro basketball history. Shut up and dribble. Shut up and dribble. 1936 Olympics. That's Judge Jeremiah Mahoney. He says no to the 1936 Olympics. America shouldn't go because of what is going on in Nazi Germany with the Jews. There's no room for discrimination on grounds of race, color, or creed in the Olympics. The American Athletic Union in 1933 accepted an invitation to compete in Berlin, provided that Germany pledged there would be no discrimination against Jewish athletes. If that pledge is not kept, I personally do not see why we should compete. Who was Mahoney? President of the Amateur Athletic Union. But Ben Johnson, who was a sprinter at the time, said he disagreed with Mahoney. The Negro in the South is discriminated against as much as the Jews in Germany. It's futile and hypocritical that Judge Mahoney should attempt to clean up conditions in Germany before cleaning up conditions in America. Avery Brundage was the head of the International Olympic Committee in 1972, U.S. Committee in 1936, and he said about this boycott, it was the existence of a Jewish communist conspiracy to keep the Americans out of the games, and Jesse Owens would win the gold medals in Berlin. 4 gold medals. The 1968 Mexico City protest was about poverty, lynching, and racism in the United States. That's Tommy Smith in the middle, John Carlos on the right, raising their fist. Peter Norman from Australia said, split your gloves up. And he's encouraging them to have a protest during the national anthem. The protest, 2 sprinters, they thought about it. John Carlos, Tommy Smith walked to the podium. They wore beads and a scarf to protest lynchings. The national anthem's played. They lowered their head, put their fists up, and the world is looking and saying, what is going on? And there is what is going on. Tommy Smith years later said, I don't like the idea of people looking at it as a negative. There was nothing with a raised fist in the air and a bowed head acknowledging the American flag, not symbolizing a hatred for it. Both of them ended up okay. Carlos was a guidance counselor at Palm Springs High School in California, and he said, I had a moral obligation to stand up. Morality was a far greater force than the rules and regulations. And Tommy Smith played in the American Football League. Smith and Carlos would keep their medals. They were never asked to return them to the IOC. Anti-war. Tom Seaver. How many of you remember Tom Seaver? Do you know he was an anti-war protester? Gonna learn something. Tom Seaver was scheduled to pitch the first game of the World Series in 1969 in Baltimore on October 11th. That morning, the New York Times ran a story in which Seaver expressed his opposition to the Vietnam War. I think it's perfectly ridiculous, by the way, Seaver was a Marine, that what we're doing about the Vietnam situation. And he said, if the Mets win the World Series, I'm going to buy an ad in the Times saying, if the Mets can win the World Series, then we can get out of Vietnam. I felt very strongly about this, and here's the ad in the New York Times. On the eve of 1970, please join us in a prayer for peace. Tom and Nancy Seaver. Arthur Ashe fought against apartheid. He wanted to go play tennis there. He was denied a visa in 1969, and he continued to keep applying and applying and applying, and he says, hey, this is discrimination. Eventually, in 1973, he would get to play in South Africa. Jimmy Carter. Oh, Russia invaded the Ukraine. Well, in 1979, Soviet Union invades Afghanistan. In the United States, well, hey, we're going to boycott the 1980 Summer Olympics in Moscow. And there would be a trade embargo on technology and grain, and you can't fish in American-controlled ocean waters. Soviet Union just ignored them. The boycott failed. They would stay in Afghanistan until 1989. Thea Gibson. She was clearly worthy of going to a major tournament, except she couldn't because she was black. And Alice Marble wrote an article in American Lawn Tennis magazine saying, hey, this is what she said. Miss Gibson is over a very cunningly wrought barrel. She's not being judged by a yardstick of ability, but by the fact her pigmentation is somewhat different. She is a fellow tennis player and as such deserving of a chance to prove herself. She got her chance and won the Wimbledon in 1957. Billie Jean King. I like Billie Jean King. She's quite the woman. Quite an interesting interview. Civil rights pioneer. Maybe not up there with Martin Luther King, but for women, she was a civil rights pioneer. And she had a role that was clearly defined. 1972, she tells the United States Open, I'm not coming in 1973 unless you equalize the prizes, winning prizes for men and women. She got it done. And it took how many years later, 49 years later, for the women to get it done? And she was part of the 1960s protests, Sea Change, which saw Title IX being passed. Title IX gave women equal educational opportunities in college starting on June 23, 1972. Mahu Abdul Raf, he was another guy who did not want to stand for the national anthem. And he stages a protest. In 1995, he viewed the flag as a symbol of oppression and racism. He's fined $32,000, but he makes a compromise with the NBA. Stand during the national anthem, but instead of standing on the flag, he'd have his head down and pray. Has no regrets whatsoever. Once you throw something out there, you have to own it. The National Basketball Players Association didn't defend him or Craig Hodges, who basically lost his job after asking George W. Bush George W. Bush, right? Why he wasn't doing more for African Americans. Two Denver radio disc jockeys went to a mosque and played the national anthem with their trumpets because disc jockeys are such mature people. 5 years later, arsonists burned down his house in Gulfport, Mississippi. The anthems in the White House. Craig Hodges and Tim Thomas. Tim Thomas, the Boston Bruins, refused to go to the White House because Barack Obama was the president, and he didn't like Obama. Hodges didn't want to meet face-to-face with George Bush. That may have cost him his job in the NBA because he spoke his mind. There was Obama in 2011. There was Hodges in 2017. When he went to the White House in the 1990s, when the Bulls won championships, he wore an African dress, dashiki, and wrote a letter highlighting the challenges facing the African-American community, and he delivers it to the press secretary. Hodges' view, the way he dressed, that was the biggest impact on his NBA fate. Even though he's still a good player, the NBA blackballs him because he was a distraction. Kevin Durant didn't go to the White House when Donald Trump was president. I don't respect who's in office right now. I don't agree with what he agrees with, so my voice is not going to be heard by doing that. He was on the championship Golden State Warrior team. Should have gone. Should have told him to his face that I disagree with you. He didn't. Donald Sterling was thrown out of the NBA in 2014. He told his mistress, don't bring black guys around. The Los Angeles Clippers, his team, their players said, we don't want him around. We're not playing for him. Sponsors pulled advertising or marketing money. The NBA threw him out. Told his mistress, don't bring black friends to games. Players threatened to walk. Marketing partners did. Sterling's thrown out of the league, but he had a long history of racist remarks that was ignored by the commissioner, David Stern. That was a banned ad in 2020 at the Super Bowl. American Eagle taking a knee. It was for PETA, People for Ethical Treatment of Animals. National Football League apparently found our new Colin Kaepernick inspired ad with its measure of inclusion and respect too daring and pressured Fox to snub our commercial for the Super Bowl. The game program is not a place for political statements, according to the NFL. The networks do take money for political ads during the Super Bowl. Michael Jordan, Tiger Woods, they were too interested in making money and not speaking out. Although by 2008, a whole bunch of athletes were speaking out. Harry Edwards said Jack Johnson, Jesse Owens were fighting for Negro legitimacy. Jackie Robinson, Larry Doby fighting for access. Muhammad Ali, Jim Brown, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, Bill Russell, Smith and Carlos for dignity, and Kaepernick starting a fourth wave. Shut up and dribble. That was the title of a show. 3-part documentary series on Showtime, providing an inside look at the changing roles of athletes in today's culture and political environment through the lens of NBA players. Some protests work. The AFL All-Star Game didn't. Most don't. Kaepernick Publishing is putting out a book on Abdul Raf, October 18th, 2022, called In the Blink of an Eye. Players today have something that they didn't have when Moses Fleetwood Walker and his brother were thrown out of sports. They have some power. But that was 1884. All these years later, and we're talking about 138 years later, players have some power. Well, thank you so much. Any questions, any comments, feel free. Have anything to say? Feel free.